That night, in the breakfast room, glowing with warm yellow light and looking out over the Port Orford Sea, my son stood up, walked around the table full of guests, and spat straight into my face. The whole table burst into laughter. I didn't wipe it off, but instead looked up at the child I had raised for 40 years, as if looking at a stranger. In that moment, I understood. Some wounds do not bleed, yet they end an entire former life. If you have ever been belittled by family, ever been put down inside the very home you built, leave a single period and tell me where you're watching from. One small piece of sharing from you is something I truly cherish. The Port Orford sea wind that night blew in that exact way that makes your skin sting dry, and your flannel feel a little heavier from the salt. From the porch I could see the yellow glow spilling from the dining room, the kind of warm light people usually attach to reunion. But to me, it only looked like a stage set for something I couldn't name. The smell of sea fish mixed into the wind, the sound of waves crashing against the cliffside, and the laughter echoing from inside. All of it blended into a loose, slippery feeling I couldn't hold on to. I walked into the house through the back door, still following old habits, passing through the garage first, hanging my cold, damp coat on the hook, brushing off the metallic dust clinging to my hands. The thin nickel layer, even after a thorough wash, still left a pale reflection on my skin. I'd lived with that my whole life. Only people who had never bent over a plating tank found it strange. The dining room was bright as day, the long table draped in white linen, my daughter-in-law's brand-new dishes, and more than 10 people chattering away. Their friends, those 30-something kids with slicked hair and shoes so clean you could see your reflection, were the type who preferred noise to cover the emptiness in their eyes. My daughter-in-law, Maris, wrinkled her nose the moment she saw me, lifting a hand to fan lightly as if waving something away. "Smell like chemicals." Again. She said it softly, but just loud enough for the whole table to hear. A friend beside her covered her mouth to laugh, her eyes skimming over me as though looking at a stain accidentally smeared onto expensive furniture. I pretended not to hear. It was the choice I had trained myself into for nearly half a lifetime, the choice of silence. My son, Carson, stood at the head of the table, one hand on the back of a chair like a host welcoming guests from a big city. Strange, considering this house, every brick, every line of mortar, I paid for when he was in his senior year of high school. He looked at me from one end of the table to the other, eyes no different from someone evaluating whether an object fit his aesthetic. "You're here, Dad. Good. Pour the wine for us, will you?" His voice sounded gentle like a command wrapped in silk. Maris smirked. "Make sure you pour evenly, Dad. Don't spill it on the new tablecloth." The guests burst into laughter. One laugh was shrill enough to puncture the air. Another was forced, the kind of laugh meant to seem polite. I knew all those laughs. They were the laughs of people who believed they were above you. I moved around the table, carefully pouring each glass. The Pinot Noir shimmered with a metallic red glint whenever it passed through the room's shadows. I figured they intentionally handed me the heaviest decanter. My hand was still steady, but I could see their anticipation. They wanted to see me tremble. A guy near the end of the table nudged his friend with his elbow, speaking just loud enough. "Hey, steady hands for an old guy who works with acid, huh?" The group snickered again. Another chimed in. "Don't get wine on your shirt. Probably harder to wash out than the chemical stains from the shop." They talked about me the way people talk in a closed conference room, thinking no one can hear, forgetting I was standing less than an arm's length away. As I set the bottle down, one of Carson's friends grabbed my wrist, lifting it under the ceiling lights. "Look at this. Acid hands." He said it as if he had just discovered something amusing, like a child finding a strange stone on the beach. The whole table exploded in laughter. "Bring it closer. Bring it closer. Let the folks from Portland see those real working hands," a woman's voice said, laughing so hard she bent over. My hand was held tight, but I didn't pull back. I stayed still. It was the only way I could keep what remained of my dignity. No yanking, no reacting. Just letting the truth run through, the way light acid solution had run across my skin my whole life. Carson tapped his glass, signaling everyone to quiet down. The clinking of glass rang out, the light catching on the facets like the nickel sheen on metal sheets I had polished all my life. All right. Let me tell everyone something. He turned toward me, one corner of his mouth lifting. He thinks he's still important, still needed. The table fell silent, waiting for a punchline. A few eyes turned to me, not out of respect, but as if waiting to see how much further I could be pushed down. A guy nearby added fuel. Well, at least he gets free room and board, right? That's something. Laughter rolled across the table like loose stones. Then he said clearly, "You don't matter, not anymore." A brief pause, as if the air itself waited to see what I would do. Maris looked at me, lips curling slightly, eyes without a trace of guilt, only curiosity, like watching a psychology experiment to see how far the old man could endure. "Say something, Dad." A girl beside her raised a brow. "Or at least give us a cheer," Carson added, his voice stretched, tinged with wine. I stood there, calm. I thought maybe things would end there, but they didn't. Someone at the end of the table tossed out another joke, not looking at me, but at Carson. Maybe he still thinks this is his house. Carson laughed, short and sharp. "House?" He smirked. "This place hasn't been yours in a long, long time." I looked straight into his eyes for the first time that evening. "Carson, I paid for the—" He cut me off, stamping out my words like snuffing a spark. "Stop. Just stop. Carson, I just want—" "Want what? Want people to remember who you used to be?" He laughed, shaking his head. "God, Dad, you really live in delusion." The table rattled with laughter. A young guy threw in, "Tell him, dude. Tear off the Band-Aid." Carson leaned slightly toward me, his voice dropping, but sharp enough that everyone heard every word. "Do you know why I asked you to pour the wine?" I didn't answer. He didn't need one. "Because that's the only position that still suits you in this house." A heavy drop of stone sank into my chest. Maris burst into laughter, patting her friend's shoulder. "He really doesn't get it." I tightened my hand slightly, but kept my voice even. "Carson, speak to your father with some respect. I'm not—" He raised a brow, his voice climbing, no longer restrained. "Not a burden?" He pointed at my chest. "You sit in the living room all day. You eat at this table. You let your chemical smell cling to everything, and you think you deserve respect?" The table erupted. Someone whispered, "Savage." I took a slow breath. "If I'm a bother, I can move out." Carson laughed loudly, elbow resting on the chair back, like he was addressing something trivial. "You? Move out? Don't joke." He stepped closer. "You staying here is our favor, not your right." I spoke slowly, each word heavy as lead. "Carson, you're going too far." He narrowed his eyes and stepped closer until only a few inches remained between us. "Too far? Too far is when you know to be quiet. Too far is when you know your place." He tilted his head, voice hissing through his teeth. "You're nothing anymore. You have no value. No one needs you. No one wants you." Carson turned toward his friends, and then back to me, mouth twisting like an actor about to deliver the final punchline. "You don't matter. Not anymore." The room held its breath. Eyes waited. Outside, waves crashed against the cliff, as if keeping rhythm with the humiliation. I didn't answer, didn't flinch, and that silence angered him. He stepped so close I could see the pulse in his neck. "Look at him," Carson said, pointing at me like an exhibit. "Still standing there as he matters." Another man shouted, "Just finish it, man." Carson stared at me for a long moment. A smile curled, one I had seen when he was a boy, hiding a prank. But now, it was soaked in malice. "Okay then," he shrugged, light as nothing, and then He spat straight into my face. But this time, he didn't just spit. He deliberately stepped back half a pace so the whole table could witness it clearly. The sharp, crisp tick of it hit with such cold clarity, I thought I could hear the sound of the last shard of respect inside me breaking. A warm bead of spit landed on my eyelid, then slowly dragged down my cheek with the weight and slime of contempt. It left a wet trail sliding to my flannel collar, soaking into the old fabric faded by years in the plating shop. The table didn't just laugh, they roared with glee. They pounded the table in excitement. Carson stood right in front of me, head tilted slightly back, his smile curving into something harsh and merciless. See? Even your silence is pathetic. I didn't wipe it. I didn't bow my head. I simply stood there, letting that hot humiliation slide down bit by bit, like drops of chemical solution eating into metal all the way to its core. And as all their laughter bounced off the walls like stones thrown against my own ribs, I knew this was no longer my home. Only then, slowly, deliberately, I raised my hand, took a napkin from the table, wiped my face, folded the napkin, set it down. No one noticed my hand trembling, but I knew it wasn't trembling from pain. It was the tremble of a man cutting the final thread and casting it into the dark Port Orford sea. I turned away without a word. I left the dining room afterward, walking through the dark hallway where the yellow lights stretched into long bands across the wooden floor, like traces of a life I had tried to hold together for too long. The laughter behind me still echoed, harsh like metal scraped across concrete. When I opened the back door and stepped into the yard, the Port Orford sea wind hit so hard that even the collar of my flannel snapped upward. There was fog that night, the kind so thick it made the whole backyard look coated in frosted glass. I went down the steps, opened the garage door, and flipped the switch. The dim neon flickered twice before staying on, casting my shadow long and stretched across the concrete floor. The smell of metal, of oil, of old wood. Scents that took only one breath to remind me I was standing in the only safe space I had left. I sat on the old metal chair by the workbench, the one I bought from a bankrupt factory, and repaired myself, welding its legs, repainting it. When the backrest gave a soft creak, I suddenly remembered the day I lost Helen. The house had been so quiet I could hear every raindrop hitting the window. Carson was 14, his young face hard with anger. He didn't cry. I don't know if he cried behind my back, but in front of me, he just stood there, as if I were the man who had lost the only person he trusted. I had to be both mother and father. 40 years in a nickel plating shop had bent my back, weighed down my shoulders, filled my lungs with chemical dust. I left for work at 4 in the morning, came home near 6 in the evening, every day with red eyes from acid fumes, hands lightly burned from plating solution, my clothes always smelling of metal mixed with machine oil. The smell Carson always complained about. Dad, don't hug me when you still have that smell on you. I worked, but I still hugged him. I cooked, hung laundry, drove him to basketball practice, paid every tuition and every pair of shoes. This house, from the floorboards to the wiring in the walls, I paid for it all. No one helped. No one carried the load. No one stood beside me. Just me and my son. I once believed that if I gave him everything, he would learn to love. But life doesn't work like that. When Carson turned 18, I decided to teach him his first lesson about responsibility. I gave him 3 small bills to handle, just 3. The electric bill, the trash bill, and the repair bill for a leaking pipe. I handed him the cash to pay them and said, "You do it. Get used to it. One day this house will be yours." I remember his expression then, not excitement, but the annoyed frown of a kid who thought he was being assigned a task beneath him. 3 weeks later, the late notices arrived. The trash bill had a $6 penalty. The electric company issued a shut-off warning. The pipe still leaked. I asked him, "Carson, did you pay them?" He answered lightly, "Forgot." And 3 months later, when I tried again, he forgot again. After that, I never gave him another bill, not because I wanted to do it all, but because I understood some children, if they lack something inside, responsibility never takes root in them. I looked at my hands, the ones called acid hands tonight, resting on my lap. These hands paid for everything: the house payments, the taxes, the roof repairs, the plumbing, the landscaping, the windows, the garage, the heating unit. Every dollar came from my sweat. Every dollar was a slice of my life. Yet tonight, he stood in front of me, pointed at me, spoke as though he were the one who funded this house, brick by brick. "You don't matter, not anymore." I drew a breath and opened the desk drawer. The old wooden box appeared. I set it on the table and lifted the lid. The house files, the original deed, tax receipts, insurance, the mortgage paid off long ago, all of them bearing the name Tobias Wexler, sole owner. I stared at that line for a long time, like looking at an old scar finally showing itself. Carson didn't contribute a single cent. His name wasn't anywhere. Not a co-owner, not an automatic heir, no rights, no contribution, no responsibility. He lived 20 years in a house I paid for in full. He ate meals I cooked. He used water I paid for. He slept under a roof I repaired. He leaned on a shadow I built. Yet tonight, he spat in my face as if spitting on someone worthless. I folded the documents, not hard but firmly, like closing a door inside myself, and I said a sentence I never expected to speak aloud in a fog-filled garage. He lives on the foundation I built, yet he thinks it's his throne. The sea wind slipped through the doorframe, carrying cold that seeped into the skin. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel cold. I didn't feel hurt. I only felt clarity. Clarity so sharp, even the neon couldn't dull it. I stood and looked at the documents one last time. The silence inside me was no longer soft, no longer weak. It had turned to metal. From that night on, I was no longer the silent father who endured humiliation. I was only Tobias Wexler, the man who would take everything back. I am not looking for pity, and I do not need an apology. I am looking for the law, and only the law. Coos Bay Law Group sat in a 3-story red brick building on Anderson Street. A clean, simple sign stood out with 3 bright metal letters, CBL. I pushed the door open. The smell of new carpet, fresh paper, and roasted coffee from the automatic machine in the corner blended neatly. The young receptionist looked up, offering a polite smile. "Who would you like to see, sir?" "I have an appointment with Mrs. Briggs." "Eleanor Briggs." "Yes, she's expecting you. Room 2B, this way." I followed the deep blue carpeted hallway, each step sounding heavy like knocking on an old door inside my chest. The door to room 2B was slightly open. At the desk, Eleanor Briggs, 58 years old, looked up at me. Her hair was short, mixed silver and brown, cut in the neat style of someone who disliked anything excessive. Her eyes were sharp, not cold, but firm, the kind belonging to a person who had seen enough family disputes to know who was lying and who was enduring. "Mr. Wexler?" "Yes. Have a seat. We have a lot to go over." I set the file stack on her desk, the deed to the house, tax bills, insurance, the paid-off loan papers, and even the copies of the 3 bills Carson once received, but couldn't manage to pay. Briggs said nothing. She put on her glasses, opened each document, and read slowly and thoroughly. I watched her eyes move over every line with a focus that bordered on clinical. 10 minutes, 15, 20. Then she set the documents down, clasped her hands, and looked straight at me. Her voice was crisp, sharp, clean as the sound of metal shears cutting sheet steel. "Mr. Wexler, your son has 0 legal rights to the house, the land, the garage, or any related asset. Not a single word, not a single percent, not one ownership claim." I held still for a beat, not surprised because I had known this for 20 years, but hearing it from the mouth of someone who had practiced law for more than 3 decades carried a different weight. Briggs continued, "This house is 100% under your name. Carson is merely occupying it with no legal standing, no paperwork, no contributions, no agreements, no mortgage shares, nothing." I nodded slowly. "I need 3 things." Briggs opened her notebook. "Go ahead." "First, a notice to vacate, 30 days. Not an eviction, but a boundary." "Understood." "Second, a cease because he's been presenting himself as the homeowner to neighbors, to friends, and to the guests last night. I want him to stop immediately." Briggs frowned slightly, not in disapproval, but in acknowledgement of the seriousness. "Fair. The law allows it since he's misrepresenting ownership. And third," I met her eyes without blinking, "prepare the paperwork to sell the house if necessary." Briggs set her pen down, leaning back. "You truly want to sell?" "I want the option. I want him to understand that the house he stood in last night, humiliating me in front of everyone, does not belong to him. And if selling it is what it takes to end his delusion, I will do it." Briggs turned the file slightly, speaking deliberately, as if guiding me through a process she knew by heart. "If you choose to sell, the escrow period in Coos County is a minimum of 45 days, no shorter. Inspection, appraisal, title review, lien clearance. All of it takes time, but I can promise you this. If you sign tomorrow, the file goes into escrow within 48 hours. I nodded. "Do it." Briggs watched me for one more beat, her expression shifting. Not pity, no doubt, but the respect is reserved for someone who no longer shakes before pain. "Are you certain?" I answered. "Since last night, I haven't spoken with emotion. I speak with the law." Briggs pressed her lips lightly, then said the line I imagined she had said to many clients betrayed by family. "The law favors no one, Mr. Wexler. It only records what has been signed." Then she stood and extended her hand. My hand, the same hand dragged under a lamp and mocked as acid hands, rested firmly inside hers. No one laughed. No one treated it like a joke. Briggs said, "I'll prepare all 3 today. The notice to vacate, the cease, and the pre-listing file for the sale. Once you sign, everything begins immediately." I nodded, my grip tight. "Thank you. Not for the law, but for stating the truth plainly." Briggs gave a small smile, the kind of smile from someone who had watched deceit collapse under the light of legal documents for far too long. Sometimes the truth only needs to be read, out loud and clear. I stepped out of the law office. The Coos Bay wind was sharp enough to cut skin, but I didn't feel cold. For the first time in years, my spine straightened. I opened my car door and looked toward the distant ocean. I didn't know what Carson's future would be, but I knew one thing. I would not argue with him ever again. I would let the papers he despised speak for me. That morning, Port Orford was covered in fog so thick I had to turn on my headlights, even though the sun had been up for more than 1 hour. I drove the old Ford Ranger out of the driveway, my hands trembling slightly from the cold, not from emotion. Last night I thought with absolute clarity, I would not argue with Carson ever again. I would not let a delusional child lead me around by words. I would let the law do its work. The road toward Gold Beach was slick with dew, but I kept a steady speed, eyes straight ahead, gray ocean to the left, black cliffs to the right. Wind struck the truck, slicing the fog into long white ribbons across the windshield. I didn't play music. I let the silence guide me. Oregon Coast Federal Bank appeared at the end of the street, a small building with bright brick walls and a new tile roof. This was where I had opened my first account the year I got married. Everyone in town knew me, and they knew my trade. When I stepped inside, the door chime rang its familiar ting. The scent of air conditioning, fresh paper, and weak coffee from the reception counter blended in the room. The clerk recognized me immediately. Good morning, Mr. Wexler. Who would you like to see? Manager Miller, I have an appointment. Yes, he's waiting for you. I walked to the glass office at the back. The door swung open, and John Miller, a bank manager with nearly 20 years of experience, stood to shake my hand. Tobias, long time. Have a seat. I sat on the padded chair. Miller studied my face for a few seconds, then gave a small nod, as if he already sensed something heavy standing behind my silence. Briggs sent the documents to me this morning. You want to review the joint account? I want everything handled today. Not one more hour of delay. Miller opened his laptop, typed a few commands, then angled the screen lightly toward me. Before we begin, I need to lay out the legal aspects. The joint account between you and Carson, correct? Correct. You are the primary holder. All principal deposits came from your main account. Carson was only added for convenience. I know. Miller looked directly at me and spoke each word clearly. That means every dollar in the principal belongs to you. Carson has no right to block, no right to oppose, no percentage of financial ownership. Whatever amount you wish to withdraw is entirely your right. I nodded. I want to withdraw every dollar I deposited. Meaning the entire balance? Yes, Miller typed. Check transaction history. Over the past 6 years, Carson has made no significant deposits. The few small amounts of spare change do not qualify as financial contributions. Therefore, under banking law, the money here is essentially yours. Withdrawing it is 100% legal. Do it. No further explanation needed. Miller printed a confirmation form acknowledging the primary holder's full withdrawal rights. I signed. My signature trembled slightly from the cold. Not hesitation. The bank printer churned, producing 2 more sheets. Miller clipped them together and showed me. This confirms the full withdrawal of your funds. The money has been transferred into your personal account, under your name, alone. I looked at the figure on the page. I wasn't surprised. I knew exactly how many years of hard work had built it. But a strange feeling washed over me, as though I had just cut loose an invisible rope that had bound me for nearly 20 years. Now, step 2, Miller said, turning the screen. You want to freeze Carson's credit, correct? Correct. Miller explained slowly, clearly, making sure I understood every part. Since Carson is listed as a secondary signer on some old loan files connected to the house, his credit behavior affects your credit score directly. If Carson opens a new debt line, you will take the hit first. I drew a long breath and said firmly, freeze everything. Miller typed, reading aloud. A credit freeze does not stop your son from spending his own money. A freeze means he cannot open new loans, adjust credit limits, or use shared credit to leverage debt. He can no longer drag you down with him. Good. He will get a notice, but it will only state, credit access restricted due to cosigner risk. It will not mention your name. I nodded. Proceed to the last step. Change the password and mailing address. I handed him a slip with the P.O. box number. Send all bank correspondence there. Nothing to the house. No one sees anything. Miller typed again, then printed a stack of papers. This is the security change confirmation. From now on, only you know the password and authentication codes. I signed each page. Slow, steady, leaving nothing unchecked. When I finished, Miller set his pen down and looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something I never expected to hear in a small coastal Oregon town. Everything is within your rights, Mr. Wexler. Not as comfort, not as sympathy, but as a declaration, a marker, a door closing behind me. I stood and shook Miller's hand. No one looked at my hands with mockery like last night. No one called them acid hands. No one laughed. I walked out of the bank. The ocean wind lashed my face, but it didn't make me cold. I opened the truck door, sat behind the wheel, and looked at the transaction confirmation resting on my lap. Everything Carson deluded himself into believing was power lived inside these papers. And now They were exactly where they belonged. In my hands. I started the engine, glanced back once. I returned to Port Orford in the early afternoon, just as the fog lifted and the sun managed to slip a faint, pale light through the gray clouds. The house came into view in the distance, the dark roof tiles, the wooden steps I sanded myself, the white fence with paint peeling in several places, a place that once was a home, once was a family, once held Helen's laughter and the small running footsteps of little Carson. Once. Now it was only a shell, a stage, a place for someone to crown himself owner of something he never spent a single dollar to build. I turned off the truck engine and sat in the cab for a few seconds. The sea wind pushed through the window crack, making a soft whistling sound, as if someone were pressing a finger to their lips, reminding me, "Silence, stay silent." I got out. Immediately I heard voices coming from the back patio, a group of young voices, unfamiliar, not the same people from last night's table, but an entirely different bunch, Carson's newer friends and co-workers, though the bragging tone and the way they laughed were exactly the same. I walked along the side path, and then I heard Carson's own voice, loud and clear as if played through a speaker. "I'm the homeowner. We let my dad stay with us. He's just a bit messy sometimes." Laughter burst out. A young man said, "Bro, this house is gorgeous. Total coastal home vibe." Carson nudged him, his tone full of the swagger of someone drinking from success he never created. "I've handled everything these past few years. The house, the yard, the garage. I take care of it all." Maris slid in with that polished fake pride expression. "He's getting older. Carson has to carry the load." The group laughed. A woman twirled a glass of white wine in her hand and said, "So you're the main provider?" Carson nodded instantly without even a beat. "Yeah, I handle everything." At the far end of the yard, I stood in the shade, unseen. I watched my son, a 34-year-old man with hair slicked shiny, a crisp white shirt, carrying the posture of someone who believed that speaking louder than others made something true. And I felt something very clearly. This house was listening to him lie. The sea wind moved across the roof. The living room curtain fluttered as if reacting. The house knew. The steps knew. I built them by hand. The garage knew. I paid for it with overtime shifts. Even the concrete foundation I poured in the rain knew. Only Carson did not know, or chose not to. I stood there for a few seconds, then stepped out of the shade. The crunch of gravel under my shoes made the whole group turn around. Carson saw me, and his expression stalled. Not out of fear, but because my sudden appearance cut off the performance he had been enjoying. "Oh, Dad," he said, "Dad," the way someone might address a housekeeper who walked into the room at the wrong time. "You're back." I didn't answer. I looked at him. Just looked, without a nod, without even a heavier breath. Maris raised a brow. "Where did you go for so long?" Still, I said nothing. I didn't need to speak. Carson let out a small, awkward laugh to break the silence. We were just chatting. These are our friends." He started introducing each one as if I needed to know who they were. I didn't look at anyone. I only looked at him. The boy I raised for 20 years, taught him how to tie his shoelaces, how to scrub paint off a bicycle frame, and eventually tried to teach him responsibility, something he never learned. One of the guys, the same voice I remembered from last night's dinner, spoke half joking, half serious. "If I had a house like this, I'd brag too." Carson laughed, then turned to me with that new superiority he had crafted overnight. "Oh, Dad, whenever you have time, could you clean up the garage? All that stuff makes the house look bad." Maris jumped in immediately. "Yeah, Dad. When guests come over and see a garage that looks like a scrap shop, it's not a good look." From beginning to end, I realized Maris had never truly cared about this house, in the sense of a home. She had never mentioned the kitchen, the living room, or the places where Helen used to leave flowers. The only things she ever talked about were the patio, the light, the view, and our friends from Portland will love this spot. Maris didn't love the house for its warmth. She loved it for the photogenic backyard and the status she thought it gave her. And thinking back, maybe she never loved Carson at all. She only loved the role of homeowner she imagined Carson had. The air stalled for a beat. I felt it clearly. Their tone was not casual. It was intentional. They wanted to push me one step lower in front of their friends to prove the power they believed they possessed. Carson crossed his arms, eyes narrowing. That garage, technically, is the area I manage. You should respect my space. He emphasized my space, waiting to see my reaction. I looked at him for a few seconds, slowly, long enough for him to swallow, even as he tried to appear calm. Then I said one sentence, a simple one, but sharp as a broken metal shard. That garage, from the very first brick, has been mine. Carson's face tightened, forcing a thin smile. Why say it like that? We've been here for years. You should let us take charge. Right, I said, just one word, not long, not explanatory, not argumentative. But that right was not agreement. It was a blade, and Carson felt it. He stared at me. The group began to quiet down. The lively air shifted to tension, then from tension to unease. Maris opened her mouth to say something, but I turned my head toward her, just once, and her lips closed on their own. I walked toward the back door. As I passed Carson, I didn't look at him. I simply said softly, just for him to hear, not loud enough for anyone else. Enjoy it. It won't be long. The words dropped onto the patio like a stone falling onto still water, silent, but sending ripples far. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The sea wind hit my back one more time. My silence was no longer endurance. It was a warning. Short, clear, sharp, and no one in that yard understood what was coming for them. The next morning, the house still smelled of wine and the residue of last night's awkward laughter. I heard Carson and Maris shuffling in the living room. Shoes, zippers, then Carson's showy voice on speakerphone. We're heading to Gold Beach to pick up some designer stuff, freshen up the wardrobe. I stood in the kitchen making coffee, saying nothing. I didn't need to say anything, because I knew exactly what was about to happen. About an hour later, the landline in the kitchen rang. I hadn't planned to answer, but Carson's voice leaked through loud enough, cracked and harsh like metal, being over-tightened. Dad, what the hell are you doing? You locked my card, didn't you? Unlock it right now. Do you know how embarrassed I am? My friends are standing right here. I took a sip of coffee, slow, calm. Then I spoke, each word cold as the Oregon Ocean in December. Your problem is yours to solve. The other end went silent for 1 second, the silence of someone realizing for the first time that he was standing exposed in front of everyone. Then Carson erupted, voice breaking. You can't do this. They're laughing at me. I set the cup down, looked out the window as the wind pushed gray clouds past the pines. They're not laughing at you because of me, I said, voice so steady it sounded like I was just reading out a weather report. They're laughing because you got used to living off someone else's money and mistook it for your own power. Simple as that. A dry click. Carson hung up. No apology. No thanks. Just the lingering tantrum of a child who never grew out of it. I finished my now cold coffee and slowly recognized something. I didn't need revenge. I just needed to step out of his life and let him face the shadow of himself. That afternoon passed quietly, the house becoming silent in a different way. Not the silence of peace, but of a storm that had changed direction. Carson avoided me. Maris slammed doors harder than usual. The friends who laughed on the patio the day before didn't come back. Everything they bragged about, everything they leaned on, began to crack the moment there was no money to cover it. I simply watched, didn't interfere, didn't say another word, because I knew this. What I had set in motion in Coos Bay would not end with a declined card. 3 days after the meeting in Coos Bay, the sky over Port Orford was so gray that even the seagulls flew lower than usual, as if trying to avoid something hanging in the air. I was sitting in the garage, my quiet shelter, when the USPS truck stopped at the gate. A single thud landed on the wooden steps. I knew what it was before I even stepped out. A white envelope. Upper left corner printed Coos Bay Law Group. Certified mail. Signature required. I picked it up, turned it over. No surprise, no hesitation. This was the first step I chose, and I had prepared for it from the moment Carson spit in my face. I set the envelope on the kitchen table. Not even 5 minutes later, Carson walked through the front door. I heard him on the phone, voice louder than normal. "Yeah, man, come by tonight. We're chilling here. My house is always open." When he saw the envelope on the table, he stuttered for a beat. "What's this?" I didn't answer. He glanced at the sender's name, and his face went pale instantly. "From Briggs? A lawyer?" He tore it open and pulled out the document. The sound of the paper tearing was like a rope stretching to its limit. In a few seconds, his eyes reached the bold line. Notice to vacate. 30 days. Silence dropped, hard as metal hitting the floor. "What? What is this?" He looked at me, his voice trembling like a spoon hitting the edge of a boiling pot. "Dad, are you joking? Why are you kicking me out of my house?" I looked straight at him. No emotion, no anger, only truth. "This is my house." Carson swallowed, eyes bulging as if he were hearing a foreign language. "But I've been living here nearly 10 years. My friends, everyone, they all know this is my house." I didn't respond. I looked at him the way you look at a stranger standing in your living room with confidence he borrowed, not earned. His breathing grew faster, each breath sharper. No, you can't do this. This is illegal. You can't kick me out of my own house. I'm the owner." I lifted a finger and pointed to the first line on the page. "Owner, Tobias Wexler. Sole title. Holder." Carson froze. His lips parted as if to say something, then closed. His eyes darted across the lines. Each sentence was a stone dropped into the waters of his delusion. Right to remove occupants. 30 days. No co-ownership. No financial contribution. Legal authority of sole title holder. "Dad, you really did this?" His voice broke, shock dripping into panic. It was no longer the voice of the man who bragged in front of his friends about being the provider. It was the voice of a man learning for the first time that power does not come from loud words. It comes from signatures on paper. I pulled out a chair and sat down, not to explain, not to comfort, but to show him I wasn't wavering. Maris came down the stairs, her eyes flicking to the paper before she turned to Carson. "Don't panic. He's bluffing. Older men do this dramatic stuff to scare people. It's not real." Carson clenched the paper so tightly the edges crumpled. "But look! Certified mail, lawyer's signature, stamped." Maris crossed her arms, shrugged with forced confidence. "He can't evict you. There has to be a lawsuit, a hearing, reasons. You're the homeowner in practice." I stood. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds, heavy as storm clouds. Carson looked at me, desperate for a single word to anchor himself. "Dad!" "Say something." Maris put her hands on her hips. "See, he's bluffing, just making a show. Everyone knows he doesn't have the guts." I cut her off with 5 words, clean, cold, and impossible to twist. "The law doesn't bluff." The sentence hit the kitchen like a blade driven straight into the wood floor. Carson went rigid. Maris swallowed hard. The air changed color instantly. No one laughed. No one held the superior posture anymore. I stepped forward, took back the envelope, folded the paper, and placed it into Carson's hand. "I'm giving you 30 days. What you do with them is up to you." Maris opened her mouth, ready to argue, but I turned toward her and looked directly into her eyes. One look, she fell silent. Carson whispered, voice cracking, "Dad, is this real?" I did not nod. I did not shake my head. I simply repeated, low and steady like cooled metal. The law does not bluff. Then I walked into the garage, closed the door, let the sound of it shutting say every other word I no longer needed to speak. From that moment on, the storm had begun. The next day, Port Orford, sunlight came into the house in that cold Oregon coast way, bright but carrying no warmth, a light that crawled across the wooden floor as if determined to expose everything the night had tried to hide. I was pouring coffee when I heard Carson's footsteps coming down the stairs. Fast, heavy, insistent, the steps of someone trying to rebuild a shattered illusion of power. He stood in the living room, hand clenched around the notice to vacate so tightly the paper wrinkled like metal being crushed. "Dad, we need to talk, right now." I set my cup down. "Talk." Carson drew in a breath like he was gathering every scrap of courage he had left. "How dare you kick me out of my own house?" I looked at him, direct, cold, unblinking. "Say that again." "This is my house." He spat out each word as if hammering a fake truth into the wall. I didn't answer with words. I answered with paper. I opened the drawer beside the kitchen counter, pulled out the stack of documents I had prepared in that fog-drenched night in the garage, and set them on the table before him, not slamming, not throwing, just placing them down like laying the final brick and letting the wall of delusion collapse on its own. The first page, deed, 100% in my name. Carson stared at the line. "Tobias Wexler, sole owner," trying to steady himself. "You only put that there too. This is the original copy filed at the Coos County Recorder's Office. Signed, notarized. Not a single word belongs to you." I flipped the next pages. 2 decades of receipts. Electricity, water, internet, property taxes, heating, roofing, plumbing. Everything a house would testify to if it could speak. 20 years, I paid every dollar. Carson swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "I never asked you to pay everything." "You didn't need to. I was the only one capable of paying." I pulled the old trash bill to the top. $28. $6 penalty stamped in red. "I gave you this when you were 18. Remember?" He stared at the paper for a long time, eyes lowering. "I forgot." "Not forgot. You never paid it. 20 years, and you still haven't paid for anything." I didn't raise my voice, but Carson stepped back half a pace, as if a window had been blown open, and the sea wind struck him full in the face. Maris came down the stairs and froze at the sight. "Don't let your dad make you think you have no rights. You lived here longer than anyone. Doesn't change a single page in this pile." My voice was steady, sharp as a claw's. She didn't have the capacity to understand. Carson slapped the notice onto the table. "What do you want? To humiliate me in front of my friends? To make the whole neighborhood think I'm some failure?" I gave him one sentence. "You did that on your own. I didn't have to help." Silence stretched until even the sound of the neighbor's front door opening felt loud. I glanced outside and saw Mrs. Trudy pressed to her window, hand over her mouth, eyes wide. 2 houses down, another curtain shifted, then another, then another. The night of the party, when Carson bragged that my old man made me look stupid, the whole street heard, and this morning they were seeing the other half, the half no one bothered to mention. Unlike that night, no one was on Carson's side. The eyes behind the curtains weren't mocking me. They were watching him, the man who called himself the homeowner, being stripped of the lie in broad daylight. Carson's face burned, red with anger, red with shame, red with the truth hitting him square. He shouted one last time, "You can't kick me out with just a few papers." I looked at him, voice cold as the steel I'd worked with for 40 years. "The papers are the law is the house, and this house is mine." Carson went still. Maris turned away, her lips trembling. The neighbors kept watching through their windows, and when a small coastal Oregon town begins to know the truth, nothing can pull it back. That night, Port Orford grew colder than usual. the ocean wind striking the windows hard enough that each vibration sounded like someone lightly knocking from outside. I sat in the garage, the pale green neon light casting a thin fog-like layer over the room, and in that cold glow, the arguing from the second floor began to spill down. Soft at first, then louder, then shattering like a glass thrown onto tile. Maris was the first to scream, her voice sharp and shrill, nothing like the gentle pretense she wore whenever friends were around. "Say it again so I can hear it clearly. You were never the owner of this house." Carson answered with a voice choked and angry, the sound of someone who'd been unmasked in front of the world, yet still clawing for one last shred of dignity. I thought I was." "Thought?" Maris laughed, a harsh, mocking hiss. "All these years I've lived here, bragged to friends, told my mother my husband handled everything, that you were the provider, and all of it was just something you thought." Carson slammed his hand against the railing. The crack echoed down into the garage like breaking wood. "Dad overreacted. He's doing this to screw me over." "No one is screwing you," Maris screamed back, her voice dripping with contempt. "Where's the paper? Where's the ownership? Go find it." Then came the sounds. Drawers yanked open, papers ripped, files tossed, footsteps pounding, an orchestra of a man desperately clawing for something that had never existed. "Nothing. There's nothing," Carson whispered, his voice unraveling like a snapped rope. Maris stood in the doorway, watching him sit on the floor amid a chaotic pile of documents. Warranty slips, credit card bills, birth certificates, things that meant nothing, and not a single sheet granting him ownership of this house. "You don't have anything that belongs to you," Carson murmured, as if reciting a verdict he had written himself. For the first time since I'd known her, Maris's face held no arrogance, no edge, only a pale shock, like someone waking from a long dream to realize they're not in a castle but on a rotting raft. "So," Maris said, each word falling like cracking ice, "all this time, we've been living off someone else?" The question didn't just pierce Carson, it pierced the house, bounced off the walls, the ceiling, the floor, and dropped straight into Carson's chest like a stone. "No!" Carson jumped up, yelling as if loudness could bend reality. "It's my house. I've lived here 20 years. "Off!" Maris screamed back, hammering the word. "You lived off. We lived off. And you acted with me, acted with the neighborhood, acted with my mother, telling everyone you were the homeowner. On paper you have nothing except the name Wexler, and even that belongs to your father." A heavy thud, the stack of papers hit the air as Carson threw everything upward. Sheets spun under the yellow light, falling like fragments of truth he'd hidden for years but could no longer outrun. Maris made a choking sound. Carson muttered, words shredded by the ocean wind drifting into the garage. "Dad did this to ruin me. He wants to humiliate me." I closed my eyes, leaned back against the cold metal chair, letting the chill of the concrete wall seep through. No, I didn't want to humiliate him. He had been doing that himself for years, by wearing a title he never had the ability to earn. After nearly 10 minutes of silence thick as frost, Carson charged down the stairs. His footsteps struck the floorboards, hard, fast, furious, desperate. He shoved open the garage door, and the sickly neon light washed over his face. Exhausted, pale, trembling, the face of a man who had just learned his life was built on sand. "Dad!" His voice was raw. "What do you want from me?" I lifted my head. We looked at each other. In his eyes there was no arrogance left, none of that "I run this house" swagger, only emptiness, the emptiness of a child lost inside the very house he believed he ruled. I spoke slowly, firmly, each word falling like a stone into still water. Some children are never lost. They just never grew up. Carson pressed his lips together, shoulders collapsing as if he finally understood. Responsibility is not something you can perform. He turned away, walking out without another word. Maris stood on the stairs, her face pale as someone watching a house collapse, while never realizing the foundation had rotted long ago. The garage door closed behind Carson, its hollow thud like a chapter slamming shut. The sea wind shook the small curtain twice. The house fell silent, but not the silence of peace, the silence of something cracking. And that cold, wind-churned night, it wasn't me. It was Carson, who for the first time in his life smelled the scent of his own failure. The next morning, the sky over Port Orford was coated in a thick layer of gray clouds. Like welding smoke, the ocean wind saltier than usual. I drove the old pickup toward Bandon, along the coastal road winding around the cliffs. I had driven this road for 40 years, back and forth between the shop and the house. But today it wasn't the familiar route anymore. It was the road to release. Bandon Real Estate Group sat in a weathered gray wood building, the sign swaying gently in the wind. When I stepped inside, the chime rang like the opening note of a new chapter. My realtor, Clara Hensley, a woman in her 50s with tight curls pinned at the nape of her neck, stood to greet me. She had that practical kind of gaze, the kind that could tell instantly whether a homeowner was desperate, greedy, or clear-minded. With me, she said only 4 words. "Are you ready?" I nodded. There was no reason to hesitate anymore. We sat at the table. Clara opened her laptop and handed me the pre-listing agreement, the initial contract before officially placing the house on the market. She laid out the timeline step by step, detail by detail. Inspection, 5 to 7 days. Photography and staging, 3 to 4 days. Listing editorial, 2 days. Estimated escrow, 45 days, Oregon Standard. I read each item, each number. My hand did not shake. It had been a long time since I felt the steady clarity of someone reclaiming ownership of his own life. When I signed the bottom right corner, the ink dried quickly, sharp and clean. Clara looked at me and asked, "You're sure you want to sell? Not keep it?" I answered immediately, without thinking. This house stopped being my home many years ago. I only kept the paperwork. Clara didn't ask further. She had met hundreds of homeowners. She knew the look of someone betrayed by their own blood. After the signatures were done, we got into the car to drive back and assess the interior. On the way back to Port Orford, I rolled down the window. The sea wind hit my face, but no longer felt cold. I did not know that the next morning, the first sound I would hear would not be the waves, but the clanging pop of a moving truck's liftgate opening at the end of the driveway, the sound announcing that this house had already begun separating me from everything that no longer belonged to me. 30 days passed slowly. That morning, the very last day of the notice to vacate, I woke to a strange sound in the driveway, the metallic slam of a moving truck's liftgate, snapping open like a signal for the storm Port Orford was about to witness. A white truck sat at the end of the driveway. The door dropped with a bang. 3 uniformed movers began carrying cardboard boxes into the house. It wasn't the first time movers had come to this neighborhood, but it was the first time they were here to move the belongings of Carson Wexler out of the house he had always called his own. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, not cold, not trembling, just steady, the kind of steadiness I thought I had lost years ago. Carson burst out the front door, hair messy, shirt half-buttoned, face pale as if he'd just fled from his own dreams. Seeing the first box, he yelled, "What the hell are you doing?" One mover answered, voice flat and professional. Interior relocation contract. Name listed, Tobias Wexler. Behind them stood a local police officer with folded arms and a blank expression. He had reviewed the notice to vacate, confirmed I was the legal owner, and simply nodded. "They're just moving property. No one is touching you." He stepped back, folding his arms again. "All procedures are valid, so no one in this yard has the right to interfere." That was me. I said it loud enough for everyone to hear. Carson spun toward me, eyes bloodshot. "You've lost your mind. This is my house. My house." Neighboring doors cracked open. People stepped onto their porches. Curious eyes lined up like an audience arriving right on time. Carson grabbed a box, yanking it back. "Nobody touches my stuff." The mover placed a hand on the box, speaking softly but sharply. "We act under the authority of the legal homeowner." The sentence hit Carson like a steel hammer. He froze. Then he stood in front of the moving truck and screamed, voice shattering like glass, "This is my house!" The scream rolled down the hill, echoed, then came back weaker than it left. At that moment, Clara Hensley's blue SUV turned into the driveway. She stepped out, clipboard in hand, composed and cold as someone carrying a verdict. She looked at Carson, then at the neighbors who were already live streaming, and spoke clearly enough for the wind to stop and listen. "Let me clarify for everyone." Silence. Every phone camera turned toward her. Clara opened the document and read one concise line. "This property is legally owned 100% by Mr. Tobias Wexler. Carson Wexler has 0% ownership or mortgage share." A man in the crowd blurted out, "So Carson was living off him?" Clara nodded. "Yes, and Mr. Wexler has full legal authority to remove any possessions not belonging to the property." The murmurs cracked open like ceramic shattering on concrete. "Knew it. Unbelievable. He bragged nonstop, too. Remodel with his dad's money. Well, everyone knows now." Carson looked at me. His face collapsed, not because he lost a house, but because he lost the role. The role he'd lived his entire life. He stepped toward me, voice thin like air leaking from a punctured tire. "Dad, you did this. In front of the neighbors? You killed me." I looked at him, not angry, not sympathetic, only honest. "I didn't do anything. You did. 20 years of it." He stepped back. I continued, each word dropping onto the concrete like a nail. "The moment you spit in my face, you destroyed the only thing I never wanted to take back, my respect for you." The neighbors stood still, hearing every syllable, understanding all of it. Carson let go of the box. Maris stood in the doorway, hand over her mouth, eyes wide as if she were watching her husband's mask fall off right in front of her. Behind her was the sofa he once bragged about, a bonus I bought. Now everyone knew, my money. The movers kept working. One box, then another. Each time the door opened, another piece of Carson's illusion vanished. And the house I built brick by brick, finally returned to the truth of itself. That night, I slept in the quiet of a temporary cabin. Strange, but not unfamiliar. In Port Orford, the story had already ended. All that remained for me was a signature. And when the Oregon morning rose through a layer of thin coastal fog, I knew I was ready to place the final period on the house I had held onto for far too long. I signed the escrow papers on a morning so clear I could see all the way to the horizon, where the sea and clouds braided into one another. 45 days later, after inspection, appraisal, and everything had passed, I returned to the escrow office one final time. Clara handed me the last document that needed my signature. The name Tobias Wexler was printed in bold on the line for the final owner. I held the pen, feeling the cold ridges of the metal barrel. No trembling, no hesitation. When the ink dried on the page, I knew what had just happened. An ending. Clara closed the file and tucked it neatly into a folder. "Congratulations, Mr. Wexler. Escrow is officially closed. No flourish, no hugging, no long handshake. The law, in its purest form, has never needed theatrics. It only needs clarity." I walked out of the office, got into my truck, and before driving off, I looked at the old house key hanging from the ring. The key I had used tens of thousands of times. The key Carson once snatched from me and slammed the door in teenage irritation. The key he used to brag to his friends. "This is my house." I removed it from the ring, set it in the glove box, and closed it. By the end of the day, the movers finished their last load. The house was empty. Silent. I stood in the middle of the living room, the place that once held laughter, the small footsteps of young Carson, and the soft humming of my wife while she cooked. Now there were only bare white walls, the cold of the tile floor, and a hollow space big enough to hear my own heartbeat. I wasn't sad. I wasn't grieving. People only grieve what truly belonged to them. This house, how long had it not been mine? I left Port Orford late in the afternoon. The sky was tinted purple, the sea wind blowing inland, carrying the smell of salt and kelp. I drove south along Highway 101 toward Brookings, a smaller, quieter town where no one knew who I was. No one cared that my son once spat in my face, or what I had lost. I stopped at a small wooden cabin rented out by a kind local homeowner. It sat between 2 rows of tall pines, cedar shingled roof, a window looking straight into the forest. I opened the door and stepped inside. A small room, a wooden table, a single bed, an old gas stove, a space no one could take from me, no one could mock, no one could invade. I set down the only bag I brought. For the first time in years, the lightness I felt didn't come from escaping. It came from choosing where to begin again. The days that followed passed slowly. I tightened a few loose boards, cleaned the cabin, walked the forest trails. Brookings was quiet. No one knew about Carson. No one asked about my past. And that silence finally gave me room to breathe. It wasn't until nearly 3 weeks later that I received a text from an old neighbor, a message that made the Oregon sky seem to pause for a beat. Carson lost his job at the seafood processing plant. Company said serious violation of internal conduct. The night he humiliated you, got back to the supervisor. He's working at the Blue Gull Diner now, waiting tables. The message came with a photo. Carson standing outside the diner, holding a tray of dirty dishes, apron stained with grease, the hair he once slicked back with shiny gel, now wilted with sweat, his face dim from late-night shifts. The fancy leather shoes he bragged about were gone, replaced by cheap, slip-resistant ones from a roadside supermarket. I stared at the picture for a long time. A man who once thought he was the homeowner, now finally learning the lesson of standing on his own feet. 2 more weeks passed, and my phone buzzed again. Maris moved out, filed for divorce, says she can't stand being laughed at by the whole town. Money's tight. They fight non-stop. I set the phone down on the cabin table and sat quietly for a long while. Not happy, not sad, just aware that everything was returning to where it belonged. At the end of the month, I drove back to Port Orford one last time, stopping at the overlook above Battle Rock. From the top, I could see the silver waves hitting the cliffs, waves that had witnessed my entire life, getting married, losing a wife, raising a boy, and the night I was betrayed inside my own home. I opened the truck door and let the sea wind hit my face, not cold, just right, a strange, precise kind of rightness. Standing there, I thought about Carson, about his eyes when he sank to the garage floor, about how he believed ownership could be built from bragging, about how he thought living somewhere long enough made it his. But houses don't function on illusion, the law doesn't function on emotion, and life doesn't function on the stories we tell ourselves. I looked down at the old house on the slope, where the new owner was moving in. No Carson, no Maris, no blind disrespect, just a structure of wood and concrete, returned to someone who valued it. I inhaled deeply, letting the salt fill my lungs. Then I whispered, just for myself, when people forget who built the foundation, the only lesson they ever learn is losing everything. I walked back to the truck, started the engine. The headlights swept across the winding cliff road, and I left Port Orford, not with a heavy heart, but with the quiet steadiness of a man who has finally given back what needed giving and reclaimed what needed reclaiming. Freedom and dignity. I lost a son, but I found a man, myself. If you've ever had someone you love forget the sacrifices you made for them, leave a subscription and tell me where you're watching from, so I know I'm not alone.